Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I remember the drive out to my grandparents being both nostalgic and strangely tense. The asphalt seemed endless, winding through fields that felt emptier than I remembered. When I finally pulled into the long gravel driveway, the crunch of the tires set me on edge for no real reason I could put into words. My grandparents' little farmhouse came into view, and although it looked the same, white paint peeling in places, a sagging porch that needed new boards, I got the sense something about the area had changed. Maybe it was just my imagination acting up. Grandma and Grandpa greeted me at the door, fussing over how much taller I'd gotten since my last visit, and asking if I was hungry. The smell of fresh cornbread wafted through the open window, which usually made me feel right at home. It sort of did at first. But while Grandma rambled about chores that needed doing, and Grandpa talked about a recent coyote problem, I found myself glancing over at the tree line more often than I wanted to admit. Nothing stood out as threatening. Still, my gaze kept drifting over there. Eventually, I decided to stretch my legs and wander out toward the woods. That big yard used to be my stomping ground when I was a kid. A place where I'd spin around until I got dizzy and collapse on the grass, staring up at the sky. Now the grass felt too tall, prickly against my ankles, and the air tasted heavier. Each step I took seemed to stir up old memories. A pang of homesickness flashed through me, weird considering I was actually at home. I walked until I reached the first cluster of trees, letting my hand brush the rough bark. Everything grew quiet. No wind, no chirping birds, not even the usual rustle in the underbrush. A strange hush settled around me. I tried to shake it off and took a few more steps under the canopy. The farther I ventured, the darker it got, even though the sun was still high overhead. Without meaning to, I started thinking about old legends my family sometimes told during late-night gatherings. Stories passed down about things best left alone. Creatures that show up when you're by yourself and vulnerable. I'd always laughed them off as spooky tales. Now, not so much. This patch of land had never seemed dangerous, but it definitely didn't feel inviting anymore. A soft snap echoed somewhere to my left. Might have been a branch, or maybe just my imagination. I froze, straining to hear anything else. Moments later, a breeze finally swept through, carrying the slightest whiff of something sour. It reminded me of damp leaves left too long in the sun. I tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to the thick undergrowth. I thought about heading back, but curiosity tugged at me. This was my childhood playground, right? Nothing to be afraid of here. Still, as I took a cautious step forward, my skin prickled. That uneasy feeling crept up my spine, and I couldn't figure out why. I glanced around once more, half expecting something to jump out, but saw only gnarled trunks and shifting shadows. I convinced myself it was all in my head, and turned around to head for the house. Tomorrow, I thought, I'd go deeper into the woods like I used to. Whatever was bugging me had to be nerves, or maybe an overactive imagination fueled by old family stories. Deep down, though, I felt a flicker of anxiety that I couldn't quite name. Something was different here, and I really wasn't sure I wanted to find out exactly what it was. I woke up thinking that maybe I just overreacted the day before. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, and everything seemed normal. Grandma in the kitchen clattering around with pots and pans. Grandpa on the porch whistling an old tune. The sense of safety that came with daylight gave me a little confidence. I decided to head back into the woods, convincing myself I needed to check if there was anything out there worth investigating. Like an animal burrow or a fallen tree. Probably nothing sinister. The moment I stepped off the porch, though, I realized the air felt oddly still again. The grass glistened with dew, dampening my shoes, and every step sounded loud in that unnatural silence. My gaze drifted to the same patch of trees I'd visited before. Part of me wanted to call it quits right then, but I just kept walking like I was on autopilot. Once I passed the first line of trees, that uneasy hush descended once more. No birds, no insects, nothing but my own breathing. I reminded myself I'd spent entire summers out here without a single scare, so I pressed on, crunching over fallen leaves until I was surrounded by trunks and tangled undergrowth. I was about to turn back when a voice trickled through the stillness, calling my name. It sounded like my mom, but off somehow, as if it were coming through an old radio with poor reception. My immediate instinct was to shout back, but a warning flickered in my mind. She was supposed to be in the house, not out here. I froze, scanning the area. I tried to trace the direction of the sound, but it seemed to dance around me, far away one moment, close the next. My pulse raced. I knew my mom wouldn't be wandering aimlessly in these woods, not in that tone. A second call echoed, and I realized it wasn't just me imagining things. My eyes flickered over to a gap between the trunks. That's where I spotted it, an impossibly tall figure hugging the bark of a wide tree. At first the details were hard to make out, but as it shifted slightly, the pale color of its skin was unmistakable. It wasn't the shade of anything alive and healthy, more like old cracked leather stretched over a frame too large for it. Its head angled to the side, revealing a mouth lined with jagged teeth that glinted in the dim light. Fear tightened every muscle, locking me in place. For a split second, I thought about calling out to it, asking if it was hurt or needed help. But the longer I stared, the more I realized how wrong it looked. It peered back at me with eyes I can only describe as hungry, and a foul smell drifted in the air, like something rotting in the sun. Without warning, it shifted away from the tree in a sudden, jerky motion, almost like it was testing how quickly it could move. My instincts overrode every other thought, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a tangle of roots. That's when a bizarre, crackling sound filled the silence, like branches snapping in half, but it seemed to come from the creature itself. My mind screamed to run, but my legs felt stuck for a moment. The sight was so horrifying that part of me refused to believe it was real. Then the creature took another lurching step in my direction, and I finally managed to turn around. I bolted through the trees, not caring how many branches or thorns scraped my arms. My breath came out in ragged bursts, and every twig cracking behind me sounded like it could be that thing, right on my heels. I forced my way through the undergrowth, practically diving over a fallen log. That rancid smell seemed to follow, lodged in my nose. My chest burned, and I was convinced I was seconds from being grabbed. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, my legs were shaking so badly I nearly fell. The yard opened up before me, bathed in the daylight that suddenly felt like the only barrier between me and whatever lurked in those trees. I sprinted to the house, heart pounding. Grandma was in the kitchen window, smiling at something on the counter, completely unaware. I slowed down just enough to look back over my shoulder. The tree line stood silent once again, as if it had swallowed the thing whole. But I knew it was there, watching, maybe even waiting for me to come back. I slipped inside without a word. A surge of nausea hit me, and I had to take a minute to steady myself. Neither Grandma nor Grandpa noticed how rattled I was, so I pretended everything was normal. But inside, I couldn't calm down. I kept replaying the moment those eyes fixed on me. That twisted version of my mom's voice drifting through the trees. That night, sleep was impossible. Every little sound, a settling floorboard, the old clock chiming, felt like a potential threat. I could practically feel the darkness pressing against the windows. There was a part of me that wanted to grab Grandma and Grandpa, pile into the car, and tear out of there for good. Another part couldn't stop wondering if it would even matter. Because once you've seen something like that, something that knows your name and isn't afraid to call it out, you start to fear it can find you anywhere. The hours dragged by. I lay rigid under the covers, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was losing my mind. Around 3 in the morning, a soft tapping started at my window. At first I thought it was just a branch, but the rhythm was too deliberate. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 more. My muscles tensed so hard they ached. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. Through the thin curtains, I could make out a tall, dark silhouette. It wasn't moving like a human should. Its limbs seemed too long, joints bending at unnatural angles. The moonlight caught something reflective, those same hungry eyes I'd seen in the forest, now peering directly at me through the glass. I wanted to scream, but my throat constricted. The tapping continued, more insistent now. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to God it would go away. When I finally gathered the courage to look again, the window was empty, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I stumbled downstairs, exhausted and jumpy. Grandpa was already at the table with his coffee. He noticed the dark circles under my eyes and asked if I was feeling all right. I hesitated, then decided to ask about the woods. "Grandpa, has anything strange ever happened in those trees behind the house?" He paused mid-sip, a shadow crossing his face. "What do you mean by strange?" "I don't know, just anything unusual. Animal attacks, people getting lost, weird sightings." His weathered hands tightened around his mug. "Those woods have been here longer than any of us. They've got a history." He cleared his throat. "Back when I was about your age, there was an incident. A man went missing. They found his clothing scattered through the trees, but never found him." My stomach dropped. "Did they think it was an animal?" "That's what the official report said. But..." He glanced toward the window. "Your great-grandfather used to talk about something living out there. Something that could mimic voices, lure people deeper into the woods." I felt the color drain from my face. "Did you ever see anything?" "No," he said too quickly. Then, softer. "But I've heard things. Voices that shouldn't be there. Your grandmother thinks it's just the wind playing tricks." He looked me directly in the eyes. "You saw something, didn't you?" I nodded slowly. "I heard Mom's voice, but it wasn't her. And I saw..." I couldn't even describe it properly. Grandpa stood up abruptly. "I want you to stay out of those woods, you understand? Whatever's out there, it's best left alone." Despite Grandpa's warning, I found myself drawn back to the edge of the tree line that afternoon. I didn't intend to go in. I just needed to understand what I was dealing with. The property felt different now, tainted by knowledge of what lurked just beyond the yard. I noticed something I hadn't before. Small animal bones scattered near the first few trees. Too many to be coincidental. They formed a kind of perimeter, like a boundary marker. Some looked fresh, others bleached white by the sun. As I stared at this grim discovery, my phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. It was Mom calling to check in. Her voice, her real voice, was comforting. I almost told her everything, but stopped myself. What could she do from hundreds of miles away except worry? "Is everything okay?" she asked, sensing my tension. "Yeah, just tired," I lied. "Grandpa's been keeping me busy with chores." After we hung up, I noticed the sun beginning to set. Long shadows stretched from the trees toward the house like fingers reaching for me. I hurried back inside, making sure all the doors were locked. That night, I set up a makeshift barricade against my bedroom door and pushed my dresser in front of the window. I was determined to get some sleep, but kept jerking awake at every noise. Around midnight, I heard it. Soft footsteps on the porch, too heavy to be Grandma or Grandpa. They circled the house, stopping beneath each window. When they reached mine, I heard that same 3-tap pattern. My heart hammered against my ribs. The footsteps continued, followed by the unmistakable sound of the back door handle jiggling. Something was trying to get in. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but had no signal. The house creaked and settled around me as if it too was afraid. The jiggling stopped, replaced by scraping sounds against the siding. It was searching for a way in. I needed to warn my grandparents. Carefully, I removed my barricade and crept into the hallway. Their bedroom door was closed. I knocked softly, then with more urgency when there was no answer. Finally, I pushed the door open. The bed was empty, covers thrown back as if they'd left in a hurry. Fear knotted in my stomach. Had it already gotten to them? I called out, my voice cracking. "Grandma? Grandpa?" A response came from downstairs, Grandpa's voice calling my name. Relief flooded through me until I remembered what had happened in the woods. I froze, listening intently. The voice called again, but something was off about it. The same wrong quality I'd noticed before. I backed toward my room, planning to escape through the window, when I heard Grandma's voice too, coming from outside the house. I peered through the hallway window and saw them standing in the yard, looking up at me with concerned expressions. They were waving frantically, motioning for me to come down. How had they gotten outside? And if they were out there, whose voice was I hearing inside? The floorboards behind me creaked. I spun around to see a dark figure at the end of the hallway. It was hunched and misshapen, but as it straightened, it grew taller, its limbs elongating impossibly. The smell hit me, decay and rot and something chemical like formaldehyde. In the dim light, I could make out features that approximated a human face, but wrong in every detail. Its mouth opened too wide, revealing those jagged teeth. From its throat came Grandpa's voice again, perfect in every way except for its source. I ran. Down the stairs, through the living room toward the front door. The thing followed, its movements jerky but fast. I fumbled with the lock, yanked the door open, and burst onto the porch. Grandma and Grandpa were there, flashlights in hand. Behind them stood 3 neighbors I recognized, all holding shotguns. The thing skidded to a halt in the doorway. For one terrible moment, we all stared at each other, the humans and the thing that wasn't. "Get away from it," Grandpa ordered, pulling me behind him. One of the neighbors raised his shotgun. The creature made a sound I'll never forget. A high, keening wail that mimicked a human scream but twisted into something profoundly wrong. Then it bolted, not toward the woods but around the side of the house, moving in that same unnatural too-fast way. The men gave chase while Grandma hurried me to a neighbor's truck. "We've known about it for generations," she explained, her voice shaking. "It comes back every few decades. Takes someone if we're not careful." I looked back at the woods as we drove away. In the darkness between the trees, I thought I saw dozens of eyes reflecting the moonlight, watching us leave. Watching and waiting. They never found the thing, despite searching for days. The official report called it a dangerous drifter who'd been squatting in an abandoned hunting cabin deep in the woods. They found evidence of recent meals, animal remains mostly, but some things they wouldn't describe to me. I haven't been back to my grandparents' place since. They sold it the following year and moved closer to town. Sometimes I still wake up hearing that 3-tap pattern on my window, though I live in a high-rise apartment now. And on windy nights, I swear I can hear voices calling my name. Familiar voices that sound almost right, but not quite. I should have listened when she told me not to say the name, but freelance journalists don't make money by playing it safe, and the story seemed too good to pass up. A cultural piece about Navajo folklore, something that could land me a spread in National Geographic if I played my cards right. The assignment came through a contact in Arizona, a photographer who'd worked the Southwest beat for years. He'd mentioned untold stories around the Four Corners region, tales that mainstream media had never properly covered, the kind of deep cultural reporting that could make a career. I flew into Gallup on a Tuesday morning in 2022, the desert air hitting me like a furnace blast as I stepped off the plane, The rental Jeep was waiting, a beat-up Cherokee that looked like it had seen better decades, but it ran, and that's all I needed for the 3-day trip I'd planned. The motel sat on the outskirts of town, a single-story strip of rooms that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Cracked asphalt parking lot, faded paint, and a buzzer system instead of a proper front desk. But it was cheap, and I was funding this trip out of my own pocket. My fixer was named Elsie Nez. I'd found her through a contact at the tribal offices, someone who could translate, navigate the cultural landscape, and hopefully connect me with elders willing to share their stories. We'd arranged to meet at a small cafe across from the government buildings. She arrived exactly on time. A woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a traditional bun, wearing a red velvet skirt and intricate silver jewelry that caught the afternoon light. There was something about her presence that commanded immediate respect. The kind of person who didn't need to raise her voice to make you listen. We exchanged pleasantries over coffee, discussing the land, the people, the challenges of preserving oral traditions in a digital age. I had my notepad out, trying to appear casual while steering the conversation toward the stories I'd come to document. "So," I said, leaning forward slightly, "I've heard there are still stories about skinwalkers out here. Traditional accounts that haven't been properly documented." The cafe went quiet. Not just our table. The entire room seemed to pause. Elsie's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips, and her dark eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach clench. "You shouldn't say that," she said quietly, setting her cup down with deliberate care. "Not here. Not anywhere." I gave what I hoped was a disarming laugh. "Sorry, I didn't mean to offend. I'm just trying to understand the cultural significance of these stories. The anthropological value." "You said its name," she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's not a story. That's a thing. And saying its name." She paused, looking past me toward the window, as if checking the shadows. "It calls it closer." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I tried to backpedal, apologizing profusely, explaining that I meant no disrespect, that I was simply a journalist trying to understand the cultural context. But Elsie's expression had already changed. She looked past me like something fundamental had shifted, like a door that couldn't be closed had been opened. "Too late," she murmured, gathering her purse. "You said it. Now it knows you're here." The motel felt different that night. Not haunted, I don't believe in ghosts, but wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The desert outside my window was absolute darkness. No streetlights, no passing cars, just an endless void that seemed to press against the glass. I'd tried to work, transcribing my notes from the meeting with Elsie, but I couldn't concentrate. Every few minutes I found myself glancing toward the window, expecting to see something looking back. The silence was oppressive, the kind of complete quiet that makes your ears ring. Unable to sleep, I stepped outside to get some air. The parking lot held only 2 vehicles, my rental Jeep and a battered pickup truck I hadn't noticed anyone drive. The air was still, not even a whisper of wind, and the temperature had dropped significantly since sunset. Beyond the motel's property line, the land fell away into a wash filled with scrub brush and scattered boulders, all cast in impenetrable shadows. I lit a cigarette and tried to convince myself that Elsie's reaction had been cultural sensitivity, nothing more. Some traditions weren't meant for outsiders, and I'd overstepped. That's when I heard it. A whistle, high-pitched and drawn out, like someone attempting to mimic a bird call but getting it slightly wrong. It echoed once across the rocks and then stopped, leaving the desert in deeper silence than before. I waited, cigarette burning down between my fingers, heart rate climbing. The sound came again, closer this time, and definitely not a bird. There was something artificial about it, something intentionally mocking about the tone. Then came the smell, Burnt hair mixed with hot metal, so strong and acrid it made my eyes water. I dropped the cigarette and stepped backward toward my room, hand fumbling for the key card. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, a sharp, panicked sound that cut off abruptly. Then another bark, from a different direction. Then silence. I rushed inside and locked the door, engaging the chain and the deadbolt. Sleep was impossible. I sat in the room's single chair, fully clothed, lights on, watching the window until dawn crept across the desert floor. Morning brought harsh sunlight and the illusion of safety. I tried to rationalize the previous night's events. Desert acoustics could play tricks, and the smell might have been from a distant fire or industrial facility. Altitude and stress could explain the rest. I stepped outside to load my camera gear into the Jeep, already planning my approach for the day's interviews. That's when I saw them. 3 parallel gouges ran down the driver's side door, each about 18 inches long and deep enough to score the metal. They were perfectly spaced, as if made by claws or talons dragged across the surface with deliberate precision. The metal showed no rust, no weathering. These were fresh. Scattered around the vehicle's tires was a fine layer of ash. Not dust or sand, but actual ash like the residue from burned wood or paper. It formed rough circles around each wheel, as if something had marked territory. I walked the perimeter of the parking lot, looking for security cameras, witnesses, any explanation for the damage. The motel owner, a tired-looking man in his 60s, emerged from the office when I knocked. "Any cameras in the lot?" I asked, pointing to the scratches. He shrugged. "Haven't worked in years. Insurance doesn't require them out here." He glanced at the damage and shook his head. "Probably kids. They come out here sometimes, get drunk, cause trouble." But I'd seen the depth of those scratches. No teenager with a knife or screwdriver could have made marks like that. These looked like they'd been made by something much larger, much stronger. When I met Elsie later that morning, she took one look at my face and knew. "When you heard it last night," she said without preamble, "did it use your voice yet?" The question hit me like ice water. "What do you mean?" She studied my expression carefully. "If it does, don't follow it. No matter how real it sounds, no matter what it promises, don't follow the voice." I wanted to ask more questions, but something in her tone told me she'd already said too much. Against every instinct in Elsie's explicit warnings, I decided to proceed with my original plan. The scratches on my Jeep could be explained away, and I couldn't let superstition derail what might be the story of my career. I'd identified a location called Yatahi's Watch on an old geological survey map, an isolated rock formation about 30 miles north of town. According to local accounts, it was a place where traditional ceremonies had once been held, before the area became forbidden. The kind of location that would provide dramatic photographs and, hopefully, connect me with the stories I'd come to document. Elsie was waiting by her truck when I emerged from the cafe that afternoon, arms crossed, face set in grim disapproval. "You're still planning to go," she said. Not a question. "Just for photographs," I assured her. "I'll be back before dark." Her expression didn't soften. "That place, Yatahi's Watch, it's a crossing point. A thin place where things move between worlds. You don't want to be there when the sun goes down." I thanked her for the warning, loaded my camera equipment, and assured her I'd be careful. Looking back, I realized she knew I wouldn't listen. The resignation in her eyes told me she'd seen this before. Outsiders who thought they understood forces they'd never comprehend. The drive took longer than expected. The roads deteriorated as I moved away from town, eventually becoming little more than dirt tracks carved across the desert floor. My GPS lost signal after the first 10 miles, leaving me to navigate by landmarks and intuition. Yatahi's Watch wasn't marked on any modern map, but I found it. A jagged spire of red rock rising from the flat scrubland like a broken finger pointing accusingly at the sky. It wasn't particularly tall, maybe 60 feet. but something about its shape felt wrong, unnatural, as if it had been twisted by forces that didn't follow normal geological rules. I parked at the base of a low ridge and began the hike toward the formation, camera bag slung over my shoulder. The afternoon sun was already sinking toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in shades of orange and deep red. I had maybe 2 hours of good light left. As I climbed the ridge to get a better angle for photographs, I noticed something that made me pause. Footprints in the sandy soil, definitely human, but wrong somehow. The impressions were too long, the toes unnaturally extended, the stride suggesting someone who moved differently than normal people. The prints led toward a cluster of boulders arranged in configurations that looked deliberate rather than random. Balanced rocks, twisted formations, shapes that suggested figures frozen mid-scream. I raised my camera to document them, and that's when I heard it again. The whistle. Same tone, same mocking quality, but much closer now. I turned toward the sound, expecting to see another hiker, or perhaps a local who could provide context for the strange formations. Instead, I saw nothing but empty desert stretching toward the darkening horizon. Then movement caught my eye, high up on the rock spire itself. A figure crouched against the last light of day, perfectly motionless. From a distance it looked human. Someone who had climbed the formation and was now watching me from above. I raised my camera, adjusting the telephoto lens to get a clearer look. What I saw through the viewfinder made my hands start to shake. The figure was wrong. Fundamentally, horrifically wrong. It had the basic shape of a human. 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso and head. But the proportions were all distorted. Too thin, like someone who had been stretched on a rack. The skin appeared bleached, almost white, pulled tight over bones that jutted at unnatural angles. Its head was the worst part. At first glance, it looked animal-like. Elongated skull, what might have been antlers or horns. But as I watched, frozen behind my camera lens, the features shifted. The antlers twisted back into the skull. The snout contracted, and suddenly it had a human face. My face. It opened its mouth, and my voice echoed across the desert. "Help! Hey, I'm up here!" I dropped the camera, hearing the expensive lens crack against the rocks. The thing wearing my appearance smiled, an expression that should have been familiar but looked alien and predatory on those stolen features. Then it began to move, crawling down the rock face with impossible speed and silence. Not climbing, crawling like an insect, its limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. I ran. The desert transformed around me as I fled. Familiar landmarks disappeared, replaced by formations I hadn't seen on the hike in. The ridge where I'd parked vanished, swallowed by an endless expanse of scrub-brush and shadow. Behind me, I could hear movement. Not footsteps, but a skittering sound, like claws on stone. Sometimes it seemed to come from my left, sometimes my right. Occasionally, it sounded like it was directly ahead, waiting for me to run straight into it. The thing had stopped using my voice, but now it employed others. I heard Elsie calling my name, her tone urgent and concerned. "Come back, you're going the wrong way." But I knew she had no idea where I was. She hadn't followed me to this place. I heard my mother's voice, dead for 3 years now, calling out comfortingly, "It's okay, honey, come toward my voice, I'll keep you safe." Each time I forced myself to run in the opposite direction, crashing through thorny brush that tore at my clothes and exposed skin. The landscape seemed to shift with each decision I made, paths closing behind me, new obstacles appearing ahead. At one point, I found myself in a grove of dead trees that hadn't been there before. Their bark was blackened as if from lightning strikes, and at the base of the largest one I discovered something that made my stomach lurch. A coyote lay split open, its internal organs carefully removed and arranged in a perfect circle around the body. The pattern was too precise to be natural, too ritualistic to be the work of ordinary predators. Something intelligent had done this, something that understood symbols and boundaries. I backed away from the grotesque display and immediately lost my bearings again. The stars above looked wrong, constellations I didn't recognize, as if the very sky had been rearranged to confuse me further. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time lost all meaning in that maze of shifting sand and stone. At one point, I collapsed behind a sandstone ledge, trying to catch my breath and think rationally about escape routes. That's when I heard it again. My own voice, whispered directly into my ear as if someone was crouched right beside me. "Why are you running from yourself?" I screamed and scrambled up the rock face, cutting my palms open on the sharp stone, not caring about the pain, only desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was hunting me. I don't remember how I made it back to Elsie's house. My next clear memory is of stumbling into her yard at dawn, clothes torn, covered in blood and desert grit, while her dogs barked frantically and backed away from me as if I carried some infectious contamination. Elsie emerged from her house, took one look at me and simply said, "You looked at it." Not a question. She knew. By that afternoon, her cousin Thomas had arrived along with an elderly medicine man named Yazzie. They carried bundles of sage, cornmeal, and other materials I didn't recognize. Black stones wrapped in red cloth, feathers bound with sinew, objects that radiated an authority I couldn't explain. I was barely conscious, dehydrated and in shock, but I understood the urgency in their movements. They were racing against something, working against a deadline I couldn't see but clearly felt. They brought me inside Elsie's house, closed all the blinds, and placed me in the center of a circle drawn with white chalk and ash. Eagle feathers marked the cardinal points, and the air grew thick with the smoke of burning herbs. "Whatever you do," Yazzie told me as they began their work, "do not look outside. No matter what you hear, no matter what calls to you, keep your eyes on the floor." The chanting began in languages I didn't understand, rhythmic and hypnotic. At first, there was only the sound of their voices and the crackle of burning sage. Then the temperature began to drop. It started subtly, a coolness that might have been air conditioning. But within minutes I could see my breath, and frost began forming on the windows despite the desert heat outside. The scratching came next. Something large moving across the roof, dragging itself from one end of the house to the other. Heavy footsteps accompanied by a wet, sliding sound that made me think of raw meat being dragged across tile. Elsie's dogs, which had been barking constantly since my arrival, suddenly went silent. Then came the voices. "Let me in." Elsie's voice, perfect in every detail, speaking from just outside the front door. "Tyler, it's okay. You're safe now." My mother's voice, exactly as I remembered it, calling from the window beside my head. The chanting grew louder, more urgent. The candles around the circle flickered as if blown by wind, though the air in the room was perfectly still. "Please," the voice outside sobbed. My voice, desperate and terrified. "Elsie, please, it's me. I don't know what's happening. I'm scared. Please let me in." Something slammed into the front door with enough force to rattle every window in the house. The impact repeated, a methodical battering that made the frame groan and the hinges shriek in protest. I broke the rule. God help me, I looked. Through the gap in the blinds, I saw myself standing in the yard. Barefoot, clothes torn, blood streaming down my face, eyes wide with terror. It looked exactly like me, down to the smallest detail. I blinked, and the figure didn't. It just smiled, and that smile kept stretching, past where lips should end, past the boundaries of human anatomy until it split the stolen face entirely. Then it dropped to all fours and skittered toward the house like a spider. I screamed and fell backward into the circle. Something massive hit the side of the house, hard enough to crack the foundation and send picture frames tumbling from the walls. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. Yazzie continued chanting until the sun was fully above the horizon. Only when natural light filled the room did he finally fall silent, exhausted but victorious. 3 days later, I was back in the city, trying to return to normal life. I told myself it had been an elaborate hallucination brought on by dehydration and stress. The mind could play terrible tricks when pushed beyond its limits. But the scratches on my rental car were real. The photos on my camera, the few that hadn't been corrupted, showed clear evidence of the strange rock formations. And Elsie's final words haunted me more than any nightmare could. "It marked you," she had said as I prepared to leave. "It didn't get in, but it got close. Close enough to know your scent, your name, your voice." "What does that mean?" I had asked. "It means you're connected now, bound to it in ways that don't break easily." "So what do I do?" "Never speak of it again. Never whistle at night. Never return to that place. And pray that God protects you from what you've awakened." For months I followed her advice. I threw myself into other assignments, stayed in well-lit cities, avoided the desert entirely. I almost convinced myself that the danger had passed. Last week I received a voicemail from a blocked number. No message, just breathing, ragged, wet, labored, and in the background, very faint, I heard someone whisper, "Let me in, Tyler." It was my voice. The thing that wears my face is still out there, still calling my name, still waiting for me to answer. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I can feel it getting closer. God help me, I think it's learning. I remember paddling onto the shore of Timber Point as dusk settled in, feeling more worn out than usual. The day had been relentless, miles of open water, the sun beating down without mercy. Still, guiding trips at Lake of the Woods always brought a strange mix of excitement and wariness. Maybe it was the way the endless trees crowded the shoreline like hungry spectators, or how legends around this place never stopped swirling among those who'd been here long enough. Whatever it was, I carried an edge of nervous energy with me as I helped unload the canoes. My co-guide, Sean, and I had 7 campers with us, ranging from 12 to 17. One of them, let's call him Trevor, rarely spoke in full sentences. When he did, the words sometimes tumbled out like he'd been bottling them up for days. I admired his determination to keep pace with everyone, but there was a look on his face that evening, almost like he wanted to tell me something and couldn't quite get it out. The shoreline felt different here. Where most campsites opened up to welcome visitors, Timber Point seemed to press inward, as if the forest was trying to reclaim what humans had carved away. The fire pit sat in a small clearing, but thick undergrowth created a wall just 10 feet beyond our tents. Ancient pines towered above us, their branches so dense they blocked out most of the dying light. While the others set up tents and tried to scrape mud off their boots, I walked the perimeter of the campsite, taking note of that shadowy border. My gut told me to keep an eye on those dark spaces between the trees. The forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles, muffling any sound that might emerge from deeper in the woods. Every step I took seemed to echo strangely, as if something was matching my pace just out of sight. Sunlight was fading fast, and the forest seemed to fold in around us like closing fingers. The moment I turned back to the main site, I spotted Trevor standing at the edge of the trees, squinting into the dimness. His thin frame looked even more fragile against the massive tree trunks. "Who is that man?" he asked, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. I stopped in my tracks and looked where he was pointing. No one was there except Sean, busy tying down a canoe near the water's edge. I called out, "Trevor, it's just us, buddy," and glanced around for any shape or movement. Nothing. We counted everyone. Still 7 campers present. Trevor just kept staring, though, like he expected something to step out from behind a trunk at any second. His eyes had that unfocused quality of someone seeing through you rather than at you. When Sean caught sight of our uneasy conversation and ambled over, I filled him in quickly. We both assured Trevor that maybe he was seeing shadows playing tricks in the fading light. Trevor didn't argue, but he didn't look convinced either. He kept his arms wrapped around his chest, and I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. Not from cold, the evening air was still warm, but from something else entirely. With everyone's stomachs growling, we decided to shift focus to dinner. We gathered around the campfire, the warmth of the flames cutting through the cool air that had started seeping up from the lake. A few of the boys tried to lighten the mood by laughing at their own unfunny jokes, while our lone girl, Amy, stayed quietly by her tent, occasionally glancing toward the tree line with nervous eyes. I felt a slight tension whenever someone's gaze drifted toward those dark spaces between the pines. It wasn't as if we'd actually seen anything concrete, but the atmosphere felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath and listening to every word we spoke. The fire crackled and popped, but beyond that small circle of orange light, absolute silence pressed against us. Even the usual night sounds were absent. No owl calls, no rustling of small animals, no buzz of insects. It was as if everything with sense enough to flee had already done so, leaving us alone with whatever preferred the darkness. By the time we finished eating, complete darkness had swallowed the last traces of twilight. The lake glimmered under the moonlight, but the woods behind us looked like a solid wall of black. I could feel eyes on us, not human eyes, but something patient and calculating. The group was spent. One by one, the kids peeled off to their tents, voices dropping to whispers as they said goodnight. Sean and I settled into our tent, mentally ticking off safety measures before trying to rest. I lay there listening to the silence, wondering why it felt so oppressive. In my years of guiding, I'd camped in hundreds of remote locations, but none had ever made my skin crawl quite like this. Hours later, or maybe it was just a long half hour, my eyes snapped open at the sound of Amy's voice cutting through the darkness. "Stop!" she called, sounding annoyed and frightened. It came from a few yards away, where her tent was pitched closest to the tree line. My pulse hammered as I scrambled for a flashlight. Sean fumbled with the zipper and yelled back, "Amy, everything okay?" She didn't answer for what felt like an eternity. When silence stretched on, I began to imagine the worst, that something had dragged her away, that we'd find only an empty tent with the door flapping open. Then she muttered something we couldn't catch, her voice muffled and shaky. We unzipped our tent and poked our heads out. Every other tent was zipped tight, no one wandering around. The breeze had vanished entirely, leaving the campsite unnervingly still. Even the lake had gone quiet, no gentle lapping against the shore. Finally, Amy's voice came again, low and trembling. "I thought you two were shaking my tent." Sean and I looked at each other in confusion. We hadn't so much as budged since turning in. No one else had crawled out of their tents. I would have heard footsteps on the pine needles or seen a flashlight beam dancing around the campsite. Trying not to sound too freaked, I said, "We've been here the whole time, Amy." After that, she went quiet. The rest of the night passed without further commotion, but I doubt anyone slept well. I lay awake listening for sounds that never came, my muscles tense and ready to bolt upright at the first sign of trouble. Every few minutes, I'd hear one of the kids shifting in their sleeping bags, confirming that none of us were finding peace. Next morning, I expected everyone to be relieved in the broad daylight. Instead, nervous chatter replaced the usual morning groans about aches and pains from sleeping on the ground. The forest looked different in the pale dawn light, less menacing but somehow more watchful, as if it had revealed only a fraction of its secrets during the night. Amy emerged from her tent flushed with frustration and something that looked like genuine fear. Her usually neat brown hair was tangled, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. "Look," she said, brandishing a bent tent stake in my face like evidence in a court case. I took it from her, puzzling over how it ended up twisted at a perfect right angle. She had another one just like it. Both stakes were mangled in identical ways. They were sturdy metal stakes, the kind that usually survive years of windstorms without bending. Professional-grade equipment designed to hold against everything nature could throw at them. Sean and I tried forcing one back into shape, but it might as well have been made of reinforced steel. It wouldn't budge. The metal felt cold against my palms, colder than it should have been after sitting in the morning sun. When I examined it closer, I noticed strange scratches along the shaft. Not the kind of wear you'd expect from normal use, but deep gouges that looked almost deliberate. Amy insisted something had yanked on her tent with tremendous force, pulling so hard that the stakes bent rather than pulled free from the ground. She joked nervously that maybe she'd pitched her tent on top of an angry bear den, but her laugh came out hollow and unconvincing. Nobody really joined in. The scratches on those stakes looked too precise, too purposeful, and the way they were bent, both at exactly the same angle, suggested something with intelligence behind it. Something that understood how to apply pressure for maximum effect. Breakfast tasted bland, even though I used the last of our precious cinnamon to spice up the oatmeal. Everyone was eager to hit the canoes and put distance between themselves and Timber Point. Whatever happened here in the night, nobody wanted to stick around and find out if it would happen again. We double-checked our gear with unusual thoroughness, counting and recounting every piece of equipment. I found myself scanning the tree line repeatedly, half expecting to see movement in the shadows. The bent stakes went into Sean's pack, evidence of something we couldn't explain and didn't want to think about too deeply. We shoved off into the calm water with more urgency than usual. I glanced back over my shoulder at Timber Point, a hard knot forming in my throat. Half of me expected to see a figure watching from the tree line, tall, pale, unnaturally still. But there was just the dim shape of our campfire's ashes and a few drifting wisps of smoke. Sean paddled alongside me, his expression tense and thoughtful. We didn't say much about what had happened. Even the kids, who usually bickered over who was the fastest paddler, kept their voices low and their eyes fixed on the water ahead. Part of me tried to shrug it all off as we gained distance from the shore. Maybe it was just bizarre bad luck. Maybe we were all spooked by some trick of the light and a couple of defective tent stakes. But part of me couldn't shake the sense that Timber Point wasn't a place you leave entirely behind. The lake stretched out before us, dotted with small islands and hidden coves. In the daylight, it looked peaceful and welcoming. But I kept thinking about how the silence had pressed against us the night before, how complete and unnatural it had been. Forests are never truly quiet. There's always something rustling, chirping, or moving through the underbrush. But Timber Point had been different, as if even the insects knew to stay away. Trevor, who had spotted the mysterious figure the evening before, sat silently in his canoe. Every so often, I'd catch him glancing back toward the island we'd left behind. His paddle strokes were mechanical, automatic, like his mind was still back there in those dark woods. I kept that thought to myself for the moment, silently hoping that the next campsite would bring only ordinary wilderness troubles. Inside, though, I was already bracing for whatever else Lake of the Woods might have in store for us. By the time we finally put several miles between ourselves and Timber Point, the sky felt lighter, like we were leaving something heavy and oppressive behind in those tangled trees. Of course, none of us actually said that out loud. We just paddled, letting the kids' nervous chatter fill the stillness. Every so often, Sean and I exchanged glances that said, "Are we really done with all that?" Neither of us wanted to be the first to admit our nerves were still jangling like alarm bells. For the next couple of days, our group followed the usual canoe trail through smaller islands and calm coves. The mornings rolled by uneventfully. The kids sang paddling songs, teased each other about who needed more sunscreen, and occasionally complained about sore muscles. Normal teenage behavior that should have been reassuring. But at night, when the fire died down and conversation faded to whispers, my mind drifted back to those bent stakes in Amy's trembling tent. The scratches on the metal haunted me, too deep and too precise to be accidental damage. I'd examined them again during a rest stop, running my fingers along the gouges. They felt cold under my touch, and I could swear they were arranged in some kind of pattern. Sean was having his own struggles with what we'd experienced. I caught him scanning the tree lines more than once, as if half expecting some pale figure to glide into view. During the day, he maintained his usual guide persona. Confident, knowledgeable, reassuring. But when he thought no one was looking, his eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there before Timber Point. On the third day after leaving the island, we found a scenic campsite on the opposite side of the lake. It had a more open clearing, surrounded by younger birch trees instead of those ancient, towering pines. At least we weren't hemmed in by walls of dense undergrowth this time. The kids seemed relieved by the change of scenery. They even built an elaborate rock circle for the fire, humming pop tunes like they were back in civilization. At first I tried to match their mood, but each flicker of the flames made me remember the oppressive silence that had fallen over our group that first night. That evening, the quiet came down heavier than before. The wind died off completely, leaving the water still as glass. It was beautiful in a way, but also unsettling. Even gentle breezes were absent, as if the entire lake was holding its breath. Once dinner ended, a couple of the kids tried to break the tension by telling jokes, but even those fizzled out quickly. The atmosphere was too thick, too expectant. Everyone kept glancing toward the darkening forest, though this campsite felt safer than Timber Point. John finally decided to spin one of the local legends. Something about sightings of a gaunt shape roaming these shores, rumored to appear when people denied its existence. The kids listened with wide eyes, glancing nervously at the forest and the still water beyond our fire's reach. I considered cutting him off as he described how people sometimes woke to find their gear mysteriously damaged or strange footprints circling their tents. But he was already in full storyteller mode, his voice dropping to that hypnotic cadence that guides use to hold an audience captive. He talked about the old-timers who claimed the thing was territorial, that it marked its domain by leaving signs for intruders to find. Bent metal, torn fabric, impossible tracks in the mud, always just enough evidence to make you wonder, never enough to prove anything definitively. By the time he finished, every crackle of burning wood made the group jump. The story felt too close to our own experience, too much like what we'd lived through at Timber Point. I noticed Amy unconsciously rubbing her arms where the tent fabric had pressed against her during that terrifying night. Trevor, usually so quiet, spoke up then. His voice was barely above a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in to catch his words. "It only comes when people don't respect it," he murmured, staring into the fire. "When they think they know better." His words sent a chill through the group that had nothing to do with the evening air. It felt like an echo from Timber Point, and the memory left a knot of dread in my chest. The way he said it, with such certainty, such quiet conviction, made me wonder what else he'd seen in those dark woods that he hadn't shared with the rest of us. The rest of that night passed uneasily. I found myself jolting awake at every rustle beyond my tent, listening for footsteps that never materialized. But somehow the absence of sound felt more ominous than any noise could have been. At least when something makes noise, you know where it is. A couple more days later, we finally made our way back to base camp. Seeing the row of cabins and hearing the bustle of other campers should have relaxed me. It was like stepping back into a world that obeyed normal rules, where strange occurrences had logical explanations and bent tent stakes were just manufacturing defects. The kids scattered to retrieve their duffel bags, grinning at the promise of clean showers and cell phone signals. Sean and I began our usual routine of hauling canoes onto racks and logging any equipment damage. But my mind was still replaying everything. Trevor's quiet warnings, the impossibly bent metal, Amy's tent shaking with violent force in the dead of night. Not long after we returned, I ran into another guide, let's call her Nicole, who'd stayed at Timber Point the night after us. When I asked how her trip had gone, she immediately launched into a disturbing story about seeing a tall, pale figure in the woods while she was off finding privacy to relieve herself. She'd assumed it was some camper wandering too far from their site. But when she got back to her group, everyone insisted they'd been gathered around the fire the whole time. No one had left the circle of light. No one had ventured into those dark spaces between the trees. I felt my stomach lurch. It was essentially the same thing we'd experienced. Someone or something lurking where it had no business being, always just at the edge of vision, never quite substantial enough to confront directly. That afternoon, word spread around base camp about my conversation with Nicole. Other guides began tossing in their own stories, each one more unnerving than the last. Impossible footprints leading right up to tent doors, then stopping abruptly. Bizarre tapping sounds on canvas in the dead of night, rhythmic and deliberate. Muffled voices echoing through the trees, speaking words in no language anyone recognized. One veteran guide swore he'd seen a faint shape slip into the water near an island that local indigenous peoples had always considered taboo. He described it as moving with purpose but wrong somehow, like a person walking underwater without disturbing the surface. The common thread in all these tales was that once people returned to base camp, the weirdness stopped completely. It was almost like the forest itself refused to let outsiders mock its presence. The incidents were contained, localized, as if something was enforcing boundaries that humans couldn't see or understand. I can't say I felt relief or terror as I listened to everyone's accounts. It was more a grim sense of acceptance, like finally understanding a rule that had always been in effect but never explained. I realized that what happened to us wasn't just a fluke or a coincidence. We'd stumbled into something larger and older than our small human concerns. Nobody used the word Wendigo openly, not in any serious way, but the older guides hinted at it in hushed tones when the younger staff weren't around. They'd shake their heads and mutter about respecting what you don't understand, about knowing when you're not welcome somewhere. Over the next few days, my thoughts kept drifting back to that night with the shaking tent and the twisted stakes. I'd remember how Trevor had pointed straight into the darkness, absolutely convinced he'd seen a person standing among the trees. His certainty had been unshakable, even when faced with our reasonable explanations. My sleep became erratic and shallow. Even casual noises, doors slamming, equipment rattling, made me think about snapping branches in those hushed, watching forests. Sean and I tried to joke it off during the day, but I could tell he was just as unsettled. We'd catch each other scanning tree lines that should have held no threat. At some point, I found myself standing alone by the base camp canoe racks, letting my eyes wander across the horizon where the lake merged with endless evergreens. Part of me wondered if I should take another trip out to Timber Point, just to prove I wasn't spooked beyond reason. But another wiser part of me counseled patience. Maybe give it time, I thought. Make sure you tread lightly if you ever go back. Some places demand respect, and ignoring that demand comes with consequences we're not equipped to handle. Right before heading in for the final night, I glimpsed something along the distant tree line, a pale vertical shape that didn't belong among the dark trunks. Another guide called me over to help with gear, and when I glanced back, nothing was there. I told myself it was a trick of the fading light, a birch tree catching the last rays of sun. Still, an uneasy knot remained in my gut. The sense that something in those woods keeps its own watch, follows its own ancient rules, and isn't keen on giving up its secrets to anyone who can't show proper respect. I couldn't decide if I was more afraid of encountering it again or never knowing what had truly been there in the first place. But as I walked back toward the safety of base camp's electric lights and human voices, I knew one thing for certain. Timber Point had marked me somehow, left its impression burned into my memory like a brand. And somewhere out there in the darkness, patient and eternal, it was waiting to see if I'd learned the lesson it had tried to teach. The forest remembers everything, forgives nothing, and always watches those foolish enough to think they can walk through its domain without consequence. Some places are meant to remain wild, untamed, and feared. I understand that now. I just pray that understanding is enough. The gravel crunched under the tires of my old Ford pickup as I navigated the winding dirt road deep into the Montana wilderness. It was the summer of 1992, and I, Liam Roscoe, was returning to a place I thought I'd left behind forever. The dense forest pressed in on both sides of the narrow path, branches scraping against the truck's sides like grasping fingers. I hadn't been back here in over a decade, not since my father passed away. The cabin, our cabin, had sat abandoned all this time, hidden away in the thick woods of eastern Montana. As I rounded the final bend, the trees parted, revealing the familiar clearing. There it stood, a weathered testament to my father's craftsmanship. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, its dark wood siding grayed with age and neglect. The porch sagged slightly, and moss had begun to creep up the foundation. But it was still standing, still solid, just like the memories it held. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the tick of the cooling motor and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. The silence out here was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the distant chatter of a squirrel. It was a far cry from the constant noise of Denver, where I'd been struggling to make ends meet as a carpenter for the past year. Work had dried up in the city, leaving me with more bills than income and a growing sense of desperation. I'd come out here to clear my head, to find some peace in the solitude of the wilderness. Maybe, I thought, I could reconnect with something I'd lost along the way. As I stepped out of the truck, the rich scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. I stretched, working out the kinks from the long drive, and took a moment to survey my surroundings. The clearing hadn't changed much. Tall grass swayed in the gentle wind, dotted with wildflowers. The tree line formed a dark, imposing wall around the perimeter, a reminder of the vast, untamed wilderness beyond. I grabbed my duffel bag from the truck bed and approached the cabin. The porch steps creaked ominously under my weight, and I made a mental note to check their stability later. The key was right where Dad always kept it, hidden beneath a loose board on the porch railing. Some things never change, I thought with a sad smile. The lock was stiff from disuse, but after a bit of jiggling, it gave way with a rusty groan. I pushed the door open, and a waft of stale air hit me like a punch to the gut. It smelled of dust, old wood, and something else, a musty, almost animal scent that I couldn't quite place. I stood in the doorway, letting my eyes adjust to the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimy windows. The cabin was a single large room with a small kitchenette in one corner and a door leading to what I knew was a tiny bathroom. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, frozen in time like a museum exhibit dedicated to my childhood. Dad's old leather armchair still sat by the stone fireplace, its once supple surface now cracked and faded. Above the mantel hung his prized hunting rifle, a beautiful lever-action .30 that had seen better days. The barrel was dull with a fine layer of rust, and I doubted it had been fired in years. Against the far wall stood a bookshelf, its shelves bowing slightly under the weight of dozens of dusty paperbacks. I recognized many of the titles: books on wilderness survival, hunting guides, and well-worn Louis L'Amour westerns that Dad used to read aloud on stormy nights. As I moved further into the cabin, memories flooded back. I could almost hear the crackling of the fire, smell Mom's venison stew simmering on the old wood stove, and feel the warmth of those long-ago family gatherings. But those days were gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that seemed to permeate every corner of the cabin. I set my bag down and got to work. The place needed a good cleaning if I was going to stay here for any length of time. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air and began sweeping out years of accumulated dust and debris. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd glance out the window, half expecting to see someone, or something, staring back at me from the tree line. But there was never anything there, just the wind stirring the branches and my own overactive imagination. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, I finished up the basic cleaning and decided to head into town for supplies. The drive took about an hour, winding through increasingly civilized terrain until I reached the small town of Pinewood. It wasn't much, a general store, a gas station, a small diner, and a smattering of houses, but it was the closest thing to civilization for miles around. The bell above the door jingled as I entered Hank's general store. The place was a throwback, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot, and shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to fishing tackle. Behind the counter stood an older man with a salt and pepper beard and deep-set eyes that seemed to scrutinize my every move. "Evening," he said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Don't recognize you, just passing through." I shook my head as I grabbed a basket and began filling it with essentials. "No, I'm staying up at the old Roscoe cabin. My father built it years ago." The man's eyebrows shot up in recognition. "Roscoe, you say? You must be Jim's boy. Liam, right?" I nodded, surprised he remembered. "That's right, I haven't been back here in years." The old man, Hank, I presumed, leaned on the counter, his expression turning serious. "Listen, son, I don't mean to pry, but are you sure about staying up there? That area, well, it's seen its share of trouble lately." I paused in my shopping, meeting his gaze. "What kind of trouble?" Hank glanced around as if checking to see if anyone else was listening, then lowered his voice. "There's been talk. People gone missing in those woods. Hikers mostly, but a couple of hunters too. Good men who knew the area well." A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "Could be anything, though, right? People get lost in the woods all the time." Hank shook his head slowly. "Not like this. And it's not just the disappearances. People have seen things. Strange lights in the sky. Noises that ain't natural. And tracks. Big tracks that don't match any animal around these parts." I wanted to dismiss it as small-town superstition, but something in Hank's eyes made me hesitate. He wasn't trying to scare me, he genuinely believed what he was saying. "I appreciate the warning," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "But I can handle myself. My dad taught me well." Hank nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Just be careful out there, son. And if you see anything unusual, you hightail it back to town, you hear?" I promised I would and finished my shopping, my mind racing with what Hank had told me. As I loaded the supplies into my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a mistake. But I'd come too far to turn back now. Whatever was out there in those woods, I told myself, I was ready for it. The drive back to the cabin seemed longer, darker. The trees loomed closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers in the glow of my headlights. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, night had fully fallen, and the forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. I hurried inside, my arms laden with supplies, and quickly set about securing the cabin for the night. I checked the locks, drew the curtains, and built a fire in the fireplace to ward off the chill that had settled in the air. As I sat in my father's old armchair, staring into the flames, I couldn't help but wonder what I'd gotten myself into. The cabin suddenly felt very small, very vulnerable in the vast expanse of the wilderness. And somewhere out there, beyond the warm circle of firelight, something was waiting, watching. I could feel it. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would push me to the very limits of sanity and survival. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls as I settled into the worn leather armchair. Despite the warmth, a chill ran down my spine. Hank's warnings echoed in my mind, mixing with the unfamiliar night sounds of the forest. I tried to distract myself by leafing through one of Dad's old survival guides, but my eyes kept darting to the windows. The curtains were drawn, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. The bedroom was small, just big enough for a single bed and a nightstand. I changed into an old t-shirt and sweatpants, then slipped under the musty blankets. The mattress creaked beneath me, and I stared up at the ceiling, listening to the wind whisper through the trees outside. Sleep came fitfully, filled with half-formed dreams of shadowy figures moving just beyond my field of vision. I tossed and turned, the unfamiliar sounds of the forest keeping me on edge. Sometime after 2 a.m., I jerked awake, my heart pounding. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it all came flooding back. The cabin, the woods, Hank's warnings. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. There. A sound. Not the wind, not the usual forest noises. This was different. Deliberate. The unmistakable snap of a twig, followed by the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. Something was moving outside the cabin. I slid out of bed, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand, I crept to the window and peered out through a gap in the curtains. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, the grass rippling in a light breeze. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then, a movement caught my eye. At the edge of the tree line, something shifted in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted, trying to make out what it was. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, its proportions all wrong for a human or any animal I knew. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, melting back into the darkness of the forest. I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? I wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a product of my overactive imagination and Hank's stories. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever it was, it had been real, and it had been watching the cabin. Sleep was out of the question now. I made my way to the main room, switching on lights as I went. The cabin suddenly felt claustrophobic, the walls pressing in around me. I grabbed Dad's old rifle from above the fireplace, checking it over with trembling hands. The action was stiff with disuse, and I had no ammunition. It was useless as anything but a club, but holding it made me feel a little better. I spent the rest of the night in the armchair, the rifle across my lap, jumping at every sound. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows, I finally began to relax. Whatever I had seen, or thought I had seen, was gone now, retreated back into the depths of the forest. But as I stood and stretched my stiff muscles, a movement outside caught my eye. I approached the window cautiously, peering out into the misty morning. There, at the edge of the clearing, the grass was bent and flattened in a distinct path leading from the trees to within a few yards of the cabin. And in the soft earth near the porch steps, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A footprint. But not like any I'd ever seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with long, spindly toes that ended in what looked like sharp claws. The print was deep, as if whatever had made it was incredibly heavy. I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. This was real. This was happening. And I was alone out here, miles from help, with something in these woods that defied explanation. As I stood there trying to process what I'd seen, a new sound cut through the morning quiet. A scream. High-pitched and terrified, it echoed through the trees, sending birds scattering from their perches. It sounded human, but there was something off about it. Something that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the scream cut off. The silence that followed was deafening. I knew I should do something. Investigate. Try to help whoever or whatever had made that sound. but fear kept me rooted to the spot. I was no hero, and I was beginning to realize just how in over my head I truly was. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I finally worked up the courage to venture outside. The morning was crisp and clear, with no sign of the terror that had gripped me during the night. I examined the footprint more closely, my sense of dread growing with each passing moment. This was no bear, no known predator. This was something else entirely. I spent the next hour searching the area around the cabin, looking for any other signs of the creature. But aside from the flattened grass and that single, terrifying footprint, there was nothing. It was as if the thing had simply vanished into thin air. As I stood at the edge of the clearing, staring into the dense forest beyond, I knew I had a decision to make. I could pack up and leave, head back to civilization, and try to forget this ever happened. Or I could stay, try to uncover the truth behind what was happening in these woods. The smart thing would be to leave, to run as far and as fast as I could. But something kept me rooted here. Maybe it was stubbornness, or a misguided sense of duty to uncover the truth. Or maybe deep down, I knew that whatever was out there wouldn't simply let me walk away. One thing was certain. I couldn't face this alone. I needed help, information, anything that might give me an edge against the unknown terror lurking in the forest. With a heavy heart, I made my way back to the cabin. I had calls to make and preparations to begin. Whatever was out there, I had a feeling it would be back. And next time, I needed to be ready. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I fortified the cabin as best I could, boarding up windows and reinforcing the door. But deep down, I knew that if whatever I'd seen decided to come for me, these meager defenses wouldn't stand a chance. I made several trips into town, each time hoping to glean more information about the strange occurrences in the area. Hank at the general store was helpful, but his knowledge was limited to local gossip and legends. I needed more. On my third trip into Pinewood, I finally caught a break. As I was loading supplies into my truck, an older woman approached me. She was small and wiry, with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through me. "You're Jim Roscoe's boy, aren't you?" she asked without preamble. I nodded, surprised. "Yes, ma'am. Liam Roscoe." She looked me up and down, as if assessing my worth. "I'm Margaret Holbrook. I knew your father. Good man." She paused, glancing around before continuing in a lower voice. "I hear you've been asking questions about the woods, about the things people have seen." My heart raced. Finally, someone who might have real information. "Yes, I have. Do you know something about it?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Not here," she said. "Meet me at the old church on the edge of town. 1 hour." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. An hour later, I pulled up to the abandoned church. It was a small, weathered building on the outskirts of town, its white paint peeling and its steeple listing slightly to one side. Margaret's beat-up station wagon was already parked in the overgrown lot. I found her inside, sitting in one of the few remaining pews. The interior was musty and dim, shafts of sunlight cutting through the dusty air from holes in the roof. Margaret motioned for me to sit beside her. "What I'm about to tell you," she began without preamble, "is not something I share lightly. Most folks around here, they don't want to know the truth. They're content to live with their eyes closed to what's really out there." I leaned in, hanging on her every word. "What is out there, Mrs. Holbrook?" She sighed, suddenly looking much older. "Something old. Something that doesn't belong in this world. The Native Americans who lived here long ago had stories about it. They called it the Wendigo." "Wendigo?" I repeated, the unfamiliar word sending a chill down my spine. Margaret nodded. "A spirit of hunger and winter. But more than that, it's a corruption, a disease that spreads through the forest like a cancer. It twists nature, warps animals and people alike into something else. I thought back to the footprint I'd seen, the impossibly tall figure at the edge of the woods. I've seen something, I admitted. Or at least I think I have. Margaret's eyes widened. Then you're lucky to be alive. The Wendigo, it doesn't just kill, it consumes. Body and soul. But what can we do about it? I asked, feeling a mix of fear and determination. She shook her head. Do? Boy, the best thing you can do is leave. Get as far away from these woods as you can and never look back. But I couldn't do that. Not now that I knew the truth. There has to be a way to stop it, I insisted. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. There might be, she said finally. But it's dangerous. The kind of dangerous that gets people killed. She reached into her bag and pulled out an old leather-bound book. This belonged to my grandfather. He was what the natives called a skinwalker, a holy man who could commune with the spirits. He spent his life trying to understand the Wendigo, to find a way to banish it. She handed me the book. It was heavy, the pages yellowed with age. Everything he learned is in here. But be warned, Liam. Knowledge comes at a price. Once you start down this path, there's no turning back. I took the book, feeling its weight in my hands. Thank you, I said. I'll be careful. Margaret fixed me with a stern look. See that you are. And Liam, whatever you do, don't let it touch you. The Wendigo's corruption spreads through contact. One touch is all it takes. With those ominous words ringing in my ears, I left the church. The sun was setting as I drove back to the cabin, casting long shadows across the road. The forest seemed darker somehow, more menacing. Back at the cabin, I pored over the book Margaret had given me. It was filled with strange symbols and dense text in a language I didn't recognize. But there were also pages in English, detailing encounters with the Wendigo and theories on its nature. According to the book, the Wendigo was more than just a physical threat. It was a spiritual corruption, a hunger that could never be satisfied. It could possess people, turning them into ravenous, inhuman creatures. But worse than that, it could infect the land itself, twisting the natural world into a nightmarish reflection of its own insatiable appetite. As I read, a plan began to form in my mind. The book spoke of a ritual, a way to potentially banish the Wendigo. But it would require venturing deep into the heart of its territory, to the place where the veil between our world and its was thinnest. I spent the next few days gathering supplies and studying the ritual. All the while I could feel eyes on me, watching from the woods. Strange noises echoed through the trees at night, and more than once I woke to find new tracks around the cabin, always just out of sight of my makeshift alarms and traps. On the 7th night after my meeting with Margaret, I knew it was time. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the forest. According to the book, this was when the Wendigo's power would be at its peak, but also when it would be most vulnerable to the ritual. I packed a bag with the necessary supplies, candles, herbs, a silver knife that had belonged to my father. The book went into the bag as well. As I stepped out of the cabin, the cool night air raised goosebumps on my skin. The forest was unnaturally quiet as I made my way along the overgrown trail. No insects chirping, no nocturnal animals scurrying through the underbrush. It was as if the entire wood was holding its breath, waiting. I had gone about a mile when I first heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness between the trees. There, just at the edge of the light's reach, I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of pairs of eyes, glowing with an unholy light. They were set at various heights, some close to the ground, others impossibly high up. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't natural. I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, the sounds of pursuit close behind. Snarls and howls filled the air, along with a high, keening wail that could have been the wind, if not for the intelligence and malice behind it. I burst into a small clearing and skidded to a stop. There, in the center, stood a massive, gnarled tree. Its trunk was twisted into a shape that was almost human, its branches reaching out like grasping arms. This had to be the place the book described, the heart of the Wendigo's power. With shaking hands, I began to set up the ritual. Candles placed in a circle, herbs burning in a small brazier. I could hear my pursuers crashing through the woods, getting closer by the second. There was no time for doubt, no room for error. As I began to chant the words from the book, the air grew thick and heavy. The moonlight seemed to bend, casting strange shadows across the clearing. The voices in the forest rose to a fever pitch, a cacophony of inhuman screams and howls, and then silence. A silence so complete it was deafening. Slowly, I turned. There, at the edge of the clearing, it stood. The Wendigo. It was tall, impossibly so, its limbs long and spindly. Its skin was a sickly pale gray, stretched tight over protruding bones. But its face was the stuff of nightmares. Empty, black eyes stared at me from sunken sockets. Its mouth, filled with needle-sharp teeth, split its face in a grotesque parody of a smile. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, with a speed that defied its gangly frame, the Wendigo charged. I dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as its claws narrowly missed me. I scrambled to my feet, desperately trying to remember the next part of the ritual. The Wendigo wheeled around, its mouth opening in a roar that shook the very ground. As it lunged for me again, I thrust the silver knife forward. The blade sank into its chest, and the creature let out a shriek of pain and fury. But it didn't fall. Instead, its hand closed around my wrist, its touch burning like ice. I could feel it then, the corruption Margaret had warned me about. It crawled up my arm like living frost, bringing with it a hunger so profound it threatened to consume me. With the last of my strength, I pushed the Wendigo away and staggered back to the center of the ritual circle. The words of the final incantation tore from my throat, my voice growing hoarser with each syllable. The Wendigo thrashed and howled, caught between the physical world and whatever dark realm it called home. As I spoke the last word, a blinding light filled the clearing. The Wendigo's screams reached a deafening crescendo, and then silence. When my vision cleared, the creature was gone. The twisted tree in the center of the clearing had turned to ash, scattering in the gentle breeze. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted and shaken. My arm where the Wendigo had grabbed me was numb, the skin pale and waxy. I knew the corruption was inside me now, a seed of the creature's insatiable hunger. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I made my way back to the cabin. I had won, but at what cost? The Wendigo was gone, banished back to whatever dark dimension it had come from. But part of it lived on in me. I packed my things quickly, knowing I couldn't stay. The corruption would spread, slowly but surely. I had to find a way to contain it, to keep the hunger at bay. And if I couldn't, well, I'd make sure I was far from anyone I could hurt. As I drove away from the cabin for the last time, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a tall, thin figure standing at the edge of the trees watching me go. But when I blinked, it was gone. The road stretched out before me, leading away from Pinewood and the horrors I'd encountered in those woods. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. The Wendigo's hunger lived on, in the land and in me. And someday, Somehow, it would return. Until then, I would keep moving, staying one step ahead of the corruption growing inside me. And I would be ready. For I had seen the true face of hunger, of insatiable appetite given form. And I knew that in the dark corners of the world, in the shadows between what is and what should not be, other horrors waited. The cabin in the woods was behind me now, but the real nightmare was just beginning. Years have passed since that fateful night in the Montana wilderness. I've traveled far and wide, always moving, never staying in one place for too long. The corruption the Wendigo left in me is a constant companion, a hunger that gnaws at the edges of my consciousness. I've learned to control it mostly. Meditation, strict dietary regimens, and the occasional ritual cleansing keep the worst of it at bay. But there are times, especially during the long, cold nights of winter, when I feel it stirring. In those moments, I can almost hear the Wendigo's call, feel the pull of the forest. I've dedicated my life to tracking down and documenting other supernatural occurrences. The world, I've learned, is far stranger and more dangerous than most people realize. My experiences in Pinewood opened my eyes to a hidden reality, one that exists alongside our own. Sometimes I hear whispers of other Wendigo sightings, reports of missing hikers in national parks, of strange creatures glimpsed in the shadows of dense forests. Each time, I pack my bags and head out, hoping to help, but also dreading what I might find. The book Margaret gave me has become my most prized possession. I've spent countless hours studying its pages, deciphering its secrets. There's so much more to learn, so many other entities and phenomena to understand. But always, in the back of my mind, I know that someday I'll have to return to Pinewood. The Wendigo may be gone, but its influence lingers, and I fear that my unfinished business there may someday draw me back to where it all began. Until then, I'll keep moving, keep searching, for answers, for redemption, and for a way to finally quell the hunger that burns inside me. The cabin in the woods may be a distant memory, but the horrors I encountered there will stay with me forever. In the end, I've come to realize that the true monsters aren't always the ones lurking in the shadows. Sometimes, the most terrifying battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. And in that eternal struggle between light and dark, hunger and restraint, humanity and savagery, we find the truest test of our strength and character. So I'll keep fighting, keep searching for answers. Because in a world where Wendigos and other horrors exist, someone has to stand guard in the darkness. Someone has to be ready when the long night comes. And who better than someone who's stared into the abyss and come back changed, but not broken? Who better than someone who carries a piece of the darkness within them? The road stretches out before me, leading to the next mystery, the next confrontation with the unknown. And as I drive into the gathering dusk, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, watching for a tall, thin figure that's always just out of sight. The hunt continues. The hunger remains. And somewhere out there in the deep, dark woods, ancient horrors wait to be discovered. You know that feeling when the silence gets so loud it's almost deafening? I was sitting in my RV, parked in a secluded spot by the river in Oregon. The perfect getaway for a few days of solitude, fishing, and unwinding. The day started like any other, with the sun breaking through the early morning fog, casting a golden glow over the dense forest surrounding me. My name is Stanley Phillips, and I am 78 years old. Life had been a roller coaster lately, and I needed this break. As I sat there, sipping my morning coffee and watching the mist rise off the river, I couldn't help but reflect on the series of events that had led me here. It had been a tumultuous year, to say the least. First, there was the unexpected layoff from the accounting firm where I'd worked for over 3 decades. I still remember the look on my boss's face as he delivered the news, a mixture of guilt and resignation. "I'm sorry, Stanley," he'd said, "but with the economic downturn and the push for younger talent, we have to let you go." Just like that, 35 years of dedication were reduced to a severance package and a handshake. Then came the divorce. Martha and I had been married for 45 years, but it seemed that losing my job was the final straw for her. "I can't do this anymore, Stanley," she'd said one night, her voice weary and distant. "I need more than this. More than you." Those words had cut deeper than any knife ever could. We'd been through so much together, raising our children, weathering financial storms, and supporting each other through life's ups and downs. But now, as we entered what should have been our golden years, she decided she wanted out. The divorce proceedings were messy and painful. Our 2 children, now adults with families of their own, tried to mediate, but it was no use. Years of unspoken resentments and unfulfilled dreams came pouring out in a torrent of accusations and bitter words. In the end, we divided our assets, sold the house we'd called home for 4 decades, and went our separate ways. So here I was, a 78-year-old man, newly unemployed and freshly divorced, sitting in a rented RV by a river in Oregon. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my entire life planning for a comfortable retirement, only to find myself starting over at an age when most people are settling into their twilight years. My plan was simple. A few days away from everything, just me, the river, and my thoughts. The campsite was ideal. Remote, quiet, with a picturesque view of the water. The sound of the river was soothing, and I had a stack of books to keep me company. I'd already spent the morning fishing, catching a couple of plump trout that I planned to cook for dinner. I'd parked my RV in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. It was a far cry from the stuffy office where I'd spent most of my adult life, hunched over spreadsheets and financial reports. As I sat there, watching the river flow by, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace washing over me. For the first time in months, the constant worry and stress that had been my companions began to ebb away. Maybe, just maybe, this solitude was exactly what I needed to heal and find my footing again. Little did I know that this peaceful retreat was about to take a dark and dangerous turn. Around noon, as I was preparing a simple lunch of sandwiches and fruit, I noticed a beat-up old truck pull into the clearing. The vehicle looked like it had seen better days. The once blue paint was now a patchwork of rust and dents, and the muffler dragged on the ground, creating a harsh scraping sound that shattered the tranquil atmosphere. Out stepped a man who looked like he'd been through his own share of hard times. He was tall and lanky, with greasy black hair that hung in his face, partially obscuring eyes that darted around nervously. His clothes, a dirty flannel shirt and worn jeans, hung loosely on his thin frame. There was something about him that set me on edge immediately, a kind of restless energy that seemed barely contained. He looked around, his eyes locking onto mine as I stood by the riverbank. "Hey there," he called out, walking toward me. His voice had a rough, gravelly edge to it, like sandpaper on wood. "Hey," I replied, trying to sound casual despite the unease growing in my gut. "Nice day, isn't it?" "Sure is," he said, his eyes scanning the area as if searching for something, or someone. "Mind if I camp here for a bit?" I hesitated. Every instinct was telling me to say no, to ask this stranger to move along. But a lifetime of politeness and social conditioning is hard to overcome, even when faced with potential danger. Sure, I guess," I finally responded, my voice betraying my reluctance. "It's a free country." "Thanks, man. Name's Vic, by the way." He extended a hand, and I shook it, his grip surprisingly strong for such a wiry frame. "Stanley," I offered, not wanting to give my full name. "Nice to meet you." Vic set up his tent a few yards away from my RV. As he worked, I watched him surreptitiously, noting the efficient way he moved, despite his apparent dishevelment. He seemed friendly enough, making small talk about the weather and the fishing conditions, but there was an air of unpredictability about him that kept me on edge. As the day wore on, we exchanged more small talk. He said he was a drifter, traveling from place to place, looking for odd jobs. His story was vague, full of gaps and inconsistencies that he glossed over with a quick smile or a change of subject. I found myself wondering what he was running from, or towards. As evening approached, a mixture of loneliness and a desire to keep a closer eye on my unexpected neighbor led me to invite him to join me for dinner. We grilled the trout I'd caught earlier, and he shared a flask of whiskey he produced from his jacket pocket. Despite my initial reservations, the conversation flowed easily as we ate. The whiskey loosened both our tongues, and I found myself opening up more than I had intended. We talked about our lives, our troubles, and our plans, or lack thereof. "So, Stanley," Vic said, taking a long pull from his flask, "what brings an old-timer like you out here all alone?" I hesitated, swirling the amber liquid in my own cup. "Just needed to get away for a bit, I suppose. Life's been complicated lately." Vic nodded knowingly. "Ain't that the truth? Life's always throwing curveballs, ain't it? Just when you think you've got it all figured out, bam, everything changes." His words hit close to home, and I found myself nodding in agreement. "That it does. Lost my job a few months back, after 35 years with the same company. Then my wife, well, ex-wife now, I suppose. She decided she'd had enough. Wanted more out of life than I could give her, apparently." Vic whistled low. "Damn, that's rough. No kids?" "Two," I replied, a hint of pride creeping into my voice despite the circumstances. "Both grown with families of their own now. They tried to help, but, well, some things you just have to work through on your own, you know?" "I hear that," Vic said, his eyes distant. "Family can be complicated." There was something in his tone that made me curious. "What about you? Got any family?" Vic's expression darkened for a moment before he forced a smile. "Nah, not really. Been on my own for a long time now. It's better that way, trust me." As the night wore on and the whiskey continued to flow, I found myself relaxing more than I had in months. The crackling fire provided a comforting background noise, and the star-studded sky above us was a reminder of just how small our problems really were in the grand scheme of things. But then, out of nowhere, Vic's demeanor changed. The easygoing mask he'd been wearing all evening slipped, revealing something darker underneath. "You ever do something you regret, Stanley?" he asked, his voice low and serious. I shifted uncomfortably, sensing a sudden change in the atmosphere. "Sure, I suppose everyone has regrets. Why do you ask?" Vic stared into the fire, his expression darkening. "Yeah, but some things you can't take back, no matter how much you might want to." There was a long pause, the silence filled with a tension that hadn't been there before. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for him to continue. "What do you mean?" I finally asked, my curiosity overcoming my growing sense of unease. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled a knife from his boot, a wicked-looking blade that glinted ominously in the firelight. He turned it over in his hands, almost lovingly, his eyes never leaving its sharp edge. "There's something I need to do," he said, his tone ominous and filled with a quiet determination that sent chills down my spine. My heart started to race, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "What are you talking about, Vic?" He looked up at me then, and I almost recoiled at the sight. His eyes, which had seemed merely troubled before, were now cold and devoid of emotion. It was like looking into the eyes of a shark. No warmth, no humanity, just a primal hunger. "I've done bad things, Stanley," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Things I need to make right. I stood up, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this man as possible. Listen, man, I don't know what you're talking about, but maybe you should leave. It's getting late and... Vic stood too, the knife still clutched in his hand. The firelight cast dancing shadows across his face, making him look almost demonic. I can't leave, Stanley. Not until it's done. Panic surged through me, and I backed away slowly, trying to keep my voice calm even as my heart threatened to burst out of my chest. Okay, let's just talk about this. There's no need for violence. Whatever it is you've done, whatever you think you need to do, we can figure it out. I can help you. But Vic wasn't listening. His eyes had taken on a manic gleam, and I realized with a sickening certainty that reasoning with him was no longer an option. He lunged at me, the knife aimed straight at my chest. I barely managed to dodge, stumbling backward over a log and falling hard on my back. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but adrenaline and fear propelled me back to my feet. I scrambled away, grabbing a heavy branch as a makeshift weapon. "Stay back!" I shouted, holding the branch between us like a shield. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, high-pitched and trembling with fear. Vic circled me, his movements predatory and deliberate. "You don't understand, Stanley. This has to happen. It's the only way to make things right." In a desperate bid to disarm him, I swung the branch at his hand. By some miracle I connected, and the knife flew out of his grip, landing in the dirt a few feet away. But Vic wasn't deterred. With a roar of rage, he tackled me and we fell to the ground, grappling for control. Years of pent-up frustration and anger fueled my struggle. Despite my age, I found a strength I didn't know I possessed. We rolled on the ground, trading blows and struggling for dominance. I could taste blood in my mouth, and every breath was a struggle, but I fought on with the desperation of a man fighting for his life. By some stroke of luck, or perhaps it was the whiskey dulling his reflexes, I managed to get the upper hand, pinning him down with my knee on his chest. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice raw with fear and exertion. He didn't answer. Instead, he laughed, a chilling, maniacal sound that sent shivers down my spine. In that moment, I realized I was dealing with someone who had completely lost touch with reality. I knew I couldn't hold him down forever. My arms were already shaking with the effort, and it was only a matter of time before he overpowered me. In a split-second decision, I raised my fist and brought it down hard on his temple. The impact sent a shockwave of pain up my arm, but it had the desired effect. Vic's eyes rolled back in his head, and he went limp beneath me. Breathing heavily, I stood up on shaky legs and retrieved the knife from where it had fallen. I didn't want to kill him. The thought of taking a life, even in self-defense, made me sick to my stomach. But I couldn't let him go free either, not when he was clearly dangerous. I stumbled back to my RV, my hands shaking so badly I could barely open the door. Inside, I found some rope I'd brought for hanging food away from bears. It would have to do. I returned to Vic's unconscious form and tied him up as securely as I could, using every knot I remembered from my brief stint in the Boy Scouts decades ago. Only when I was sure he was securely bound did I allow myself to breathe. I sank to the ground, my back against a tree, and tried to process what had just happened. The peaceful retreat I'd planned had turned into a nightmare, and I found myself longing for the mundane problems that had seemed so insurmountable just days ago. With trembling hands, I pulled out my cell phone, something I'd brought for emergencies but had hoped not to use. To my relief, I had a weak signal. I dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. They assured me that help was on the way, but warned it might take some time given my remote location. As I waited for the authorities to arrive, I kept a wary eye on Vic's still form. What had driven him to this? What demons was he wrestling with that could lead him to attack a stranger in the wilderness? I found myself filled with a strange mixture of fear, pity, and anger. When the police finally arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness of the forest, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. They took Vic into custody, still groggy and confused from the blow to his head. I gave my statement, explaining everything that had happened from the moment Vic had arrived at the campsite. The officers searched Vic's truck, and what they found chilled me to the bone. There was evidence of multiple crimes, stolen goods, weapons, and even a few missing persons IDs. It seemed I had unknowingly camped next to a dangerous fugitive, someone who had been leaving a trail of destruction across the country. As they drove away, Vic secured in the back of a patrol car, I watched in silence, my mind reeling from the night's events. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance to escape my problems and find some clarity. Instead, I found myself at the center of a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. The next morning, I packed up my belongings with shaking hands. Every rustle in the bushes, every snapping twig made me jump. The idyllic setting that had seemed so peaceful just days ago now felt oppressive and threatening. As I drove away from the campsite, my mind kept replaying the events of the previous night. I couldn't shake the image of Vic's cold, emotionless eyes as he lunged at me with the knife. I found myself wondering about the lives he had affected, the families of the missing persons whose IDs were found in his truck. How many others had crossed paths with him and not been as fortunate as I was? The drive home was a blur. I barely noticed the beautiful Oregon scenery passing by outside my window. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of what-ifs and could-have-beens. What if I hadn't invited him to dinner? What if I hadn't been able to overpower him? What if the police hadn't arrived when they did? When I finally arrived home, a small apartment I'd rented after selling the house during the divorce, I felt like a different person than the one who had left just a few days ago. The problems that had seemed so overwhelming before my trip now felt trivial in comparison to what I'd just been through. In the days that followed, I found myself jumping at every unexpected sound, checking the locks on my doors obsessively, and sleeping with the lights on. The trauma of my encounter with Vic had left deep scars, both physical and emotional. I received a call from the local police department a week after the incident. They informed me that Vic, whose real name turned out to be Victor Holloway, was a suspect in a string of violent crimes across 3 states. The detective on the phone praised my actions, saying that my quick thinking had likely saved lives. But his words, meant to be comforting, only served to underscore the gravity of what I had been through. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself struggling to return to any semblance of normalcy. The apartment that had once felt like a symbol of my failure, a downgrade from the house I'd shared with Martha, now felt like a safe haven. I was reluctant to leave, even for simple errands. My children, worried about my withdrawal, began to visit more frequently. At first, I was hesitant to share the full extent of what had happened by the river. How could I explain the terror I'd felt, the way my view of the world had fundamentally shifted? But as time passed, I found that talking about it, painful as it was, helped to lessen the burden. One evening, as my daughter Sarah and I sat on my small balcony watching the sunset, she turned to me with concern in her eyes. "Dad," she said gently, "have you thought about talking to someone? A professional, I mean." My initial reaction was to dismiss the idea. I was a man of a different generation, one that didn't put much stock in therapy or counseling. But as I looked at my daughter's worried face, I realized that my experience wasn't just affecting me, it was impacting my entire family. With Sarah's help, I found a therapist who specialized in trauma counseling. Dr. Elena Rodriguez was a kind-faced woman in her 50s with a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. In our sessions, she helped me process not just the incident with Vic, but also the accumulated stress and grief from losing my job and my marriage. "What you're feeling is normal, Stanley," she assured me in one of our early sessions. "You've been through a traumatic experience, and it's okay to feel shaken. But I want you to know that you're also incredibly strong. You survived, and now we're going to work on helping you thrive." Slowly but surely, with Dr. Rodriguez's guidance and the unwavering support of my children, I began to heal. I started to venture out more, first just to the corner store, then to the local park. Each small step felt like a victory. 3 months after the incident, I received another call from the police department. Vic's trial was approaching, and they wanted me to testify. The thought of facing him again filled me with dread, but I knew it was something I had to do. The day of the trial arrived, and as I sat in the witness stand, I found myself looking directly at Vic for the first time since that night by the river. He looked different now, clean-shaven, dressed in a suit, his wild eyes now dull and resigned. As I recounted the events of that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, anger, but also pity for this lost soul whose life had taken such a dark turn. After the trial, which resulted in Vic's conviction, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't the end of my journey, but it felt like the closing of a chapter. In the months that followed, I found myself embracing life with a new perspective. The brush with death had awakened in me a deep appreciation for the simple joys I'd once taken for granted. I rekindled old friendships, took up new hobbies, and even started volunteering at a local community center. 1 year after the incident, I made a decision that surprised even me. I bought another RV. My children were understandably concerned, but I explained to them that I couldn't let one terrible experience rob me of something I loved. Life is unpredictable, I told them, echoing the words I'd exchanged with Vic that fateful night, but imbuing them with new meaning. Sometimes it throws you into situations you're not prepared for, but in the end, it's how you handle those moments that define who you are. And so, on a crisp autumn morning, I found myself back on the road. This time, I wasn't running away from my problems, but moving towards a future full of possibilities. As I drove, the scenery flying by outside my window, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Yes, there was still fear. Yes, there were still nights when I woke up in a cold sweat, the memory of Vic's cold eyes haunting my dreams. But there was also hope, resilience, and a newfound appreciation for the preciousness of life. As I pulled into a new campsite, this one bustling with families and fellow retirees, I couldn't help but smile. I set up my chair by the RV, cracked open a book, and breathed in the fresh air. The sound of children's laughter mingled with the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and I felt truly at peace for the first time in years. Life, I realized, was a lot like the river I'd camped beside that fateful night. It could be calm and soothing one moment, wild and terrifying the next. But it always kept flowing, carrying us forward to new experiences, new challenges, and new opportunities for growth. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast. To life, with all its unexpected turns, to survival, to healing, and to the endless possibilities that each new day brings. I may be 78 years old, but I've never felt more alive. And as for me, I'll never forget that night by the river, not because of the fear it instilled, but because of the strength it revealed within me. It was the night I faced my darkest fears and came out alive, forever changed, but undefeated. The night has fallen now, and the campsite is quiet, save for the crackling of fires and the soft murmur of conversation. Tomorrow is a new day, full of promise and potential, and I, Stanley Phillips, am ready to embrace whatever it may bring. As the weeks passed, I found myself settling into a new rhythm of life on the road. The fear that had once gripped me began to loosen its hold, replaced by a sense of adventure I hadn't felt in years. I traveled across state lines, meeting fellow travelers and collecting stories that would have once seemed beyond my reach. One crisp autumn morning, about 6 months into my journey, I found myself drawn back to Oregon. The leaves were turning, painting the landscape in vibrant hues of red and gold. As I drove along the winding roads, Memories of that fateful night flickered through my mind, but they no longer held the same power over me. I decided to return to the spot where it all happened, not out of morbid curiosity, but as a way to face my fears head-on. As I pulled into the familiar clearing by the river, my heart raced, but I took deep breaths, remembering the techniques Dr. Rodriguez had taught me. The campsite looked different in the autumn light. The trees that had once seemed menacing now stood as silent sentinels, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. The river, which had been a constant backdrop to that night of terror, now gurgled peacefully, its waters reflecting the blue sky above. I set up my camp, my movements slow and deliberate. As I worked, I found myself talking out loud, addressing the memories that lingered here. "You know," I said to the empty clearing, "I thought coming back here would be harder, but I'm not the same man who left this place a year ago. I'm stronger now. Wiser, maybe." As the day wore on, I fished in the river, cooked my catch over an open fire, and watched the sun set behind the trees. The simple acts that had once been overshadowed by fear now filled me with a profound sense of peace. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. For a moment, old fears threatened to surface, but I breathed through them, reminding myself that I was safe. A park ranger's truck pulled up, and a young woman stepped out. "Evening, sir," she called out. "Just doing my rounds. Everything okay here?" I smiled, feeling a sense of déjà vu, but this time without the undercurrent of dread. "Everything's fine, thank you. Just enjoying the evening." The ranger, whose name tag read Emily, paused for a moment. "You know," she said, "we don't get many solo campers out here these days. Not since..." She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Not since the incident last year." I finished for her. "With the drifter?" Her eyes widened. "Yes, exactly. How did you..." I took a deep breath. "I was here that night. I'm the one who..." Recognition dawned on her face. "Oh my God, you're him. Stanley, right? I read the report when I started this job. Are you... Is it okay for you to be here?" I nodded, surprised to find that I meant it. "It is. In fact, I think I needed to come back. To reclaim this place in a way." Emily sat down across from me, her curiosity evident. Would you mind telling me about it? We use that incident in our training now, but hearing it firsthand..." And so, as the fire crackled and the stars came out overhead, I found myself sharing my story once again. But this time, it wasn't with a therapist or a courtroom. It was here, in the very place where it all began, with someone whose job it was to protect others from similar dangers. As I spoke, I realized that my story had taken on a new dimension. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about resilience, about the strength of the human spirit to overcome trauma and find meaning in the darkest of experiences. Emily listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and sharing some of her own experiences as a ranger. As our conversation wound down, she stood up, a look of admiration in her eyes. "Thank you, Stanley," she said earnestly. "Your story, it's going to help a lot of people. Do you mind if I share it with my colleagues? It could really make a difference in how we approach solo campers and potential threats." I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the fire. "I'd be honored," I replied. After Emily left, I sat by the fire for a long time, lost in thought. I realized that by coming back here, by sharing my story, I had transformed this place. It was no longer just the site of a traumatic event. It had become a place of healing, of connection, of passing on hard-won wisdom. As I crawled into my RV that night, I felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun here a year ago, a journey of fear, survival, and ultimately growth, had come full circle. The next morning, as I packed up to leave, I took one last look around the clearing. The river flowed on, unchanging, yet ever-changing, much like life itself. I picked up a smooth stone from the riverbank and slipped it into my pocket, a tangible reminder of this place and all it had come to mean. As I drove away, I felt lighter somehow. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I was Stanley Phillips, 79 years old, survivor, storyteller, and above all, a man still on a journey of discovery. The road stretched out before me, full of possibilities. Where would I go next? What new adventures awaited? For the first time in a long while, I felt truly excited about the future. Life, I had learned, could be unpredictable and sometimes terrifying. But it could also be beautiful, surprising, and filled with opportunities for growth and connection. As I merged onto the highway, heading towards new horizons, I smiled to myself. This was not the end of my story. In many ways, it felt like just the beginning. 5 years have passed since that fateful night by the Oregon River, and life has taken me on a journey I never could have anticipated. My story, first shared with Ranger Emily that night at the campsite, took on a life of its own. Word spread through the park ranger community, then to law enforcement agencies, and finally to the media. Before I knew it, I found myself speaking at conferences, writing articles, and even consulting on outdoor safety programs. The experience that once haunted my nightmares became a tool for helping others. I worked with psychologists to develop strategies for solo travelers to stay safe and mentally prepared. My children, once worried about my solitary adventures, became my biggest supporters. Sarah even joined me on several speaking engagements, adding her perspective on how families can support loved ones who've been through traumatic experiences. Vic, I learned, passed away in prison 3 years after his conviction. The news brought a complex mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a final sense of closure. I chose to honor the lives he had impacted by establishing a support group for survivors of violent crimes and their families. My wanderlust never faded. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year. I upgraded my RV to a more accessible model as I entered my mid-80s, determined not to let age slow me down. I've now traveled to every state in the U.S., collecting friends and stories along the way. Each new place I visit, each person I meet, reinforces the lesson I learned that night in Oregon, that life is precious, unpredictable, and full of potential for growth. Today, on my 84th birthday, I find myself back in Oregon. Not at that same campsite. Some places are better left as memories, but at a beautiful spot overlooking the Pacific Ocean. My children and grandchildren have joined me for a celebration that's as much about life as it is about my birthday. As I watch the sun setting over the water, my great-granddaughter Lily, just 5 years old, climbs into my lap. "Great-grandpa," she says, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Mommy says you're a hero. Is that true?" I chuckle, pulling her close. "I'm not sure about being a hero, sweetheart, but I did learn something important that I want you to always remember." "What's that?" she asks. "That no matter what happens in life, no matter how scary things might seem, you're stronger than you know. And there's always hope. Always a new adventure waiting just around the corner." Lily nods solemnly, as though absorbing a great truth. Perhaps she is. As she snuggles against me, I look out at my family gathered on the beach. Sarah and her husband are helping the younger kids build a sandcastle. My son Michael is setting up for a barbecue, laughing with his wife as they work. The scene fills me with a joy so profound it brings tears to my eyes. This, I realize, is the true end of the story that began that night by the river. Not just survival, not just recovery, but this. A life fully lived, rich with love, adventure, and purpose. As the last rays of sun dip below the horizon, I make a silent toast, much like I did that night years ago when I first set out on my RV journey after the attack. To life, with all its twists and turns. To the strength we find in our darkest moments. To the power of second chances. And to the beautiful, unpredictable journey that lies ahead, no matter our age. The stars are coming out now, twinkling above the Pacific. Tomorrow, we'll pack up the RV and head out again, this time with 3 generations of my family in tow. Where will we go? What new adventures await us? I don't know, and that's the beauty of it. My name is Stanley Phillips. I'm 84 years old. And my story? Well, it's still being written, one day at a time.